North Korea is calling Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, his meetings in North Korea regrettable. The secretary met with Kim Jong-un's top advisor, Kim Young-chol, and according to Pompeo, they made, and this is a quote, progress on almost all of the central issues. But that's apparently not how Pyongyang sees it. They released this statement. We expected the U.S. to bring constructive measures to build confidence in accordance with the spirit of the U.S.-North Korea summit. However, the attitude of the U.S. in the first high-level talks held on the 6th and 7th were indeed regrettable.
They went on to say that the result of the talks were very worrisome. Now, also of note here, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un did not meet with Pompeo.
Joining us now, CNN Pentagon correspondent Ryan Brown.
Ryan, Pompeo and North Korea's versions here of the exact same meetings don't seem to match up at all. What exactly does this mean?
Well, definitely. We're hearing very different tones coming from North Korea and from Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Now, speaking to reporters while still in Pyongyang before boarding his aircraft, Pompeo said that progress had been made, and he said that both sides remained committed to complete denuclearization of the North Korea.
Well, your characterization is interesting. We talked about what the North Koreans are continuing to do and how it's the case we can get our arms around achieving what Chairman Kim and President Trump both agreed to, which was the complete denuclearization of North Korea. There's no one walked away from that. They're still equally committed. Chairman Kim is still committed. I had a chance to speak to President Trump this morning. My counterpart spoke with Chairman Kim during the course of our negotiations as well. We had productive, good faith negotiations.
Now, it seems to be the big source of disagreement here is what exactly complete denuclearization means. State Department officials have long said that that would include verification, language that they continue to use, while the North Korean statement said the talks really, one of the issues they had with the talks was Pompeo's focus on issues like verification, irreversible denuclearization, as opposed to focus on other steps that North Korea wanted to highlight, which is what they said is the dismantling of a recent test facility for ICBMs and the repatriation of remains of U.S. service members who died during the Korean War. So still seems to be an increasingly widening gulf between the two sides as they attempt to negotiate denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula and pursue the results from the Trump-Kim summit in Singapore.
Ryan, to the agreed upon definition of denuclearization. Remember, the administration talked about complete, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization. Yes. Now they're simply saying complete denuclearization. The question of what will the U.S. have to give to get that? When the North Koreans say they expected the U.S. to bring constructive measures to build confidence, that seems like what they're going to there.
Well, that seems to be the real challenge, is exactly determining what that verification regime will look like, how intrusive inspections will be, what the North Koreans would have to produce. And arms experts have long said that any real agreement would have to have these measures in place in order for it to, because of North Korea, the scope and scale of its nuclear program. It's been hiding it for decades from American and other countries' surveillance programs. So because of that scale, the verification program would have to be large. North Korea is seeming to push back on any intrusive verification, at least in this initial meeting.
All right, Ryan Brown for us there in Washington. Ryan, thank you very much. You bet. President Trump heads to Brussels next week for the NATO summit, and he plans to talk to world leaders about one of his pet peeves. The country's not spending enough on their defense, while the U.S. foots, as he says, most of the bill. Candidate Trump had described NATO countries as freeloaders, owing back payments to NATO and threatening to shift U.S. military presence unless they increase defense spending. Let's take a look, though, at how NATO works first. Question generally, what is NATO? North Atlantic Treaty Organization is a group of countries in North America and Europe committed, very basic definition here, to defending one another. It was founded in 1949. This is after World War II, at the start of the Cold War, and started with 12 countries focused on fighting off then Soviet aggressions, the expansion of communism across Europe, and as NATO characterizes it, to encourage European political integration. Now, the U.S. was the leading founding member here. NATO also gave the U.S. a strong foothold in Europe. Today, there are 29 member countries, and that number could grow to 33 in the next round of expansions. Bosnia-Herzegovina, Georgia, Macedonia, and Ukraine all want to join. Why? Well, in large part, the security of NATO's Article 5. It guarantees that an attack on any member of NATO is considered an attack on all its members, and all members are bound to respond or assist the attacked member country. Article 5 has been invoked just once in the nearly 70-year history of NATO. It was by the United States after 9/11. So why would those four countries that we just talked about want to join NATO now? Well, for the same reasons the organization was founded: common defense against Russian aggression. Putin has been expanding Russian influence in the Balkans. Russia invaded Georgia in 2008. And of course, you know about Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014. This organization was expressly formed as a defense against Russia. And President Trump's warming to Putin and hostility towards NATO understandably worries some of its members. Let's talk now with former NATO Ambassador Ivo Daalder. He's the author of the book, The Empty Throne, America's Abdication of Global Leadership. Mr. Ambassador, thank you for joining us this morning.
My pleasure.
We, of course, invited you here to talk about NATO, but with the breaking news as it relates to the talks with North Korea, I want to get your response to what we're hearing from North Korea. And I'm going to read for you a quote here from KCNA, and this is what they say. The issues that the U.S. delegation kept insisting to the end of the talks are the very same cancerous issues that amplified the distrust and a danger of risk of war of the past administrations, which all ended in failure. The outcome of the talks are very worrisome. Considering the framework the president has created around the talks in Singapore, what's your reaction to what you're hearing now from North Korea?
Well, of course, it's regrettable. We want to have progress on denuclearization discussions that were started in Singapore, and this was the first follow-up on that meeting. On the other hand, it wasn't totally unpredictable. I think the president and some in his administration held out the prospect of something that wasn't going to happen. Kim Jong-un was not going to give up his nuclear weapons just because he had a good meeting in Singapore with the President of the United States. He has these nuclear weapons to ensure the survival of his regime. And that's one of the reasons that he, his father and grandfather, acquired those weapons over the past 20-plus years, and why it has been so difficult, even through negotiations or economic pressure that we have seen over the years, to get them to reverse course. The only way to do that is deep, intensive kinds of diplomacy backed by real pressure, not by the kind of statements that we are seeing coming out of the White House that the nuclear threat has disappeared just because two leaders have met. The threat is there, it needs to be met, and diplomacy is the best way to go about it.
Mr. Ambassador, I want you to watch and listen this exchange between Kim Yong-chol and Secretary Pompeo earlier today. Let's watch this.
This is your first visit to our country yet. This was your first night in our country. Did you sleep well last night?
I did. Thank you. Thank you for the accommodation.
But we did have very serious discussion on very important matters yesterday. So thinking about those discussions, you might have not slept well last night.
Director Kim, I slept just fine. We did have a good set of conversations yesterday. I appreciate that, and I look forward to our continued conversations today as well.
Now, I don't know if you have a monitor there, and we had subtitles up on the screen, but Kim suggests that thinking about the discussions that they had on the previous night, that the secretary might not have slept well, and the secretary says he slept just fine. Considering the discrepancies between what we're hearing from the State Department and what we're hearing from North Korea, are you confident that the U.S., the administration, is even honest about the characterization of these meetings thus far?
Well, I think we will have to wait until Secretary Pompeo is back and he's no longer in Pyongyang, and he will have an opportunity to brief the president and others in the administration before we know what really happened. But clearly, if there had been any idea that these talks would lead to the rapid denuclearization of North Korea, we've heard the National Security Advisor, John Bolton, and others talk about a year or 2.5 years. This is going to be a decade-long process only if, and that's a big if, the North Koreans are in fact willing to move in this direction. And I think what we saw in the talks in Pyongyang is the reality that the United States is demanding something from North Korea that the North Koreans aren't willing to do. And it isn't surprising because they haven't been willing to do it for a very long time.
Mr. Ambassador, let's turn now to NATO. And Nicholas Burns, former Undersecretary of State, says that this is the most serious transatlantic crisis in 70 years in the history of NATO. Is that hyperbolic, or has this reached crisis level?
No, I think he's right. Whether it's the worst in 70 years or not is for the historians to debate. But we are clearly at a very, very critical point. On the one hand, you could see this coming week a NATO summit that could, by all measures, be a grand success. If the president came and said, "I'm come here to fully put my shoulders behind the NATO alliance to reaffirm the fundamental American commitment to the defense of Europe and the strengthening of NATO, and take credit at the same time for what has already been achieved." NATO defense spending is up. The deterrence in Eastern Europe has been bolstered. NATO is possibly more united than it has been in many, many years, and it could confront a Russian threat that is growing and real. If the president were willing to take both credit for it and say, this is something we want to do together, then this could be a success. But I fear that everything we hear, including the president just the other day talking about allies killing us, which is the kind of language you hear from adversaries, not from allies, that we will have a meeting in which the president is going to harp about the fact that the Europeans aren't spending enough on defense, something, by the way, every president has said, and seek to divide the alliance, as he has at the G7, as he had over trade issues, and now over defense spending, rather than unite him, and then seek to have a very good and comfortable meeting with Putin. If that happens, then I do think the alliance faces a true crisis of historical proportions.
Finally, on that meeting with Putin, you've said that the biggest worry in Europe is that the president will make unilateral concessions after this confrontational meeting at NATO. Which specifically are the most worrisome on that list of potential concessions?
Well, so if you remember in Singapore, it was Kim Jong-un who said that exercises, which he called war games, were provocative, and that led the president to unilaterally end it. Well, what does Vladimir Putin find provocative? He finds NATO enlargement, the adding of new members, provocative. He finds the deployment of defensive forces in Eastern Europe and the Baltic states provocative. He finds U.S. missile defense in Europe provocative. And my worry, and I think the European worry, is that on some or all of these issues, the president is willing to make concessions to stop the deployment of missile defenses, to halt the forward deployment of European and NATO and U.S. forces, and to say no more to NATO enlargement. Those are the kinds of concessions that are would be unilateral and deeply hurting of the alliance. And if that were to come about, as we saw in Singapore as possible, then I think we are facing, again, a crisis of truly historic proportions.
Former U.S. Ambassador to NATO, Ivo Daalder, thank you so much for being with us.
My pleasure.